Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 10 of On Air. Today, we're doing a discussion on curating at the end of the world. It's a panel discussion made up out of curators that are currently working with Kahn Selesnick. And I'm so excited to hear their approaches, their ideas, their ways of dealing with the concepts that Kahn and Selesnick bring up in their works. So today joining us, we have Maura Coughlin, who we've heard of from before in our art historical conversation. So visit that one again if you are interested in hearing her talk more about the art historical references that Kahn and Selesnick use. But Maura will be joining our panel discussion today with her co-curator, Mark Adams. They work together on the Providence Town Art and Association Museum exhibition that will be opening up in this fall. Mark will also be joining us for a different episode for On Air late or early in May, where he'll be sharing more of his experiences, his thoughts, his ideas around Kahn Selesnick's work and how it relates to his other job, which is a cartographer for the National Park Services. I'm super excited to hear more about that as well, the mapping of territories and how Kahn Selesnick are using landscape and those conversations, the in-field mechanics of it and how they've applied that to their work. So thank you so much, Maura and Mark, for joining us. And then also today we have our very own Executive Director, Andrew Oot, joining us. He's worked with Kahn and Selesnick before, and he now brought Kahn and Selesnick to Lux. So we're super excited for you to join us as well, Andrew. Before we jump in, I want to give our daily shout out to our community businesses. Today, we want to give a shout out to Prager Brothers. They're a craft bakery specializing in high quality breads. Their mission is to restore the time-honored tradition of artisan bread making. Prager Brothers' new Encinitas location on the 101 is now open, Monday through Sunday, 8:30 to 4:30, and Victor will share a link to them. So I would love to start just a general welcome. Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Greetings. So great.
So I would love to start with just a kind of general knowing of how you've come to work with Kahn and Selesnick, how did your collaboration start, and what is the project that you're working on? Maybe we can start with you, Maura and Mark, about your collaboration.
You want to start, Mark?
Sure. If you like. Well, I've known these guys since the early 90s when I arrived on Cape Cod, and there was this whole swirling ecosystem of an arts community here. I came to do mapping to work for the National Park Service, but I'm also an artist. And, we moved in the same circles of beach fires and potluck dinners and drag croquet and things like that in the community. We shared studio space back at the Fine Arts Work Center before they had a summer program, and that's kind of a golden age of when studio space was easy to come by. And people kind of moved in and out of each other's studios and saw their work. But my first impression of them was as these classicists, doing painting doing these plaster portraits with herbs and things that kind of hark back to frescoes. I was totally fascinated by that, especially being a naturalist and a scientist and a writer. Let's see, my background was in landscape architecture, ecology, firefighting, scientific illustration, and painting. Maybe that's enough of a beginning.
It's funny, I think it was in the mid-90s, I was over at a friend's house in Truro, and I saw this fantastic reproduction of one of their works on someone's refrigerator. And it was a procession, one of the ones from early on, I think it was before the Future Bog project, but it was just so marvelously weird and delightful and absurd. And then I started seeing their work in Provincetown. I remember the big panoramic photographs. And I just so admired their, I don't know, wacky ingenuity, the kind of screwball comedy that made so much sense. And I remember thinking, wow, I want to do that. And then I gradually have gotten to know them. I have spent a little bit of time in Brittany, in France, with Nick and his partner, Sarah. And last fall, I was over there. They have a house in Morlaix, and we set off on an adventure one day. And first we went to an amazing exhibition about cabinets of curiosity that was put on by the Leclerc Foundation. Everything from Renaissance cabinets of curiosity to contemporary artists who work with that. And then we had lunch, and then we went for a hike in a bog, and Nick took pictures of Sarah and I as sort of these weird demons of the bog. And that's like a perfect day with the two of them.
Sure.
But I'm an art historian, and I work a lot on coastal cultures and ecosystems in visual art in France. And so a lot of my interests have started intersecting with theirs, and it's really exciting to work with them and talk with them.
Great. Andrew, what about yourself?
Well, I have not known them as long as these two, but I have known them for a little bit of time. The first time that I saw their work was probably in about 2006. So this is only 14 years ago. I was working on a publication project with a museum in San Francisco, and their work was one of many others' work. And obviously I was intrigued by all the work that was being presented, but certainly theirs had this interesting quality to it that felt as if they were storytelling through their work, which is often very different from other creators, other makers, is that most of the time you would think of a specific object or a result of creation, but it feels like their work is a little bit more allegorical and it goes further than that. We can continue that conversation later. But after that, the museum had presented their work in exhibition, and I met Nicholas at the opening of that exhibition. It was actually at the Nobel Peace Center in Norway, in Oslo. And we just hit it off really well at that point, and kept talking, and we were still engaging through that museum. And then when I left, eventually, I ended up bringing their work with me when I moved to Colombia, and I had a fine art gallery there. And so we presented their work on a number of different occasions. And just over the last 14 years, have been in contact and showing their work and continuing to talk about it.
I love that. I want to start off, and Maura, you touched upon this a little bit, this concept of absurd, and they've talked about their troupe Fledermaus being this absurdist troupe. I don't know about you guys, but for me as a second language, I always heard the word absurd, but it wasn't until we got Kahn Selesnick to come to an exhibition that I really dove into what does the absurd actually mean. And this really fascinating description of the absurd being the coexistence, or kind of this inability of trying to reconcile the coexistence of existentialism and nihilism, and this like wonderful, absurd dichotomy that is created from this wanting to create meaning and there not being any meaning. And I found it so interesting, and thinking about that, how as a curator do you deal with this dichotomy in an exhibition? How do you represent that? How do you relate that to the community that comes to see?
Yeah, I think it's important to give some context for their work. And I like the way that in their books, there's always a lot of writing, because on first glance, their work on the one hand might look just silly, and on the other, it might look too pretty. And I was thinking a lot about the fact that, I have things to say about the idea of beauty in their work, but with absurdity, I think absurdity has been a very powerful theatrical and artistic quality, and literary as well, because if you think of, for instance, Dada and surrealism, really erupted out of the lack of rationality that people felt like the world had dissolved. The rationality of the world had dissolved after the First World War. And, Dada and surrealism kind of erupt out of that damaged collective consciousness. Ionesco, in his Theater of the Absurd, felt that, or writing about the Theater of the Absurd, I believe, said something along the lines that, realistic theater is not as interesting as theater that can present an imaginative truth that can be a kind of higher truth than realism. So I think the absurd contradictions that they work with are totally appropriate for our time, when, nearly every day recently, there's something in the news that defies any kind of rational thought. And I think it's an utterly appropriate mode to talk about what's going on right now.
Yeah. What about you, Mark? Do you have thoughts on the absurd?
Yeah, absolutely. I love it. Part of it in the context here of this artistic community, there's a real there's a thread of transgressiveness and anarchy here, and in my in meeting them in the 90s and hanging out in those circles, there was everything always kind of turned into a performance. And that performance, was, partly because of the strong queer component to this community. Performance was always a bit absurd and pushing the limits. But one thing that you see immediately all through their work is a kind of sincerity too. And it's never completely nihilistic there's always a kind of, what it mirrors is that every 7-foot drag queen in Provincetown is also a bird watcher. Every character, every artistic character is also just entranced by nature. They're believers. And it may sound like a contradiction, but it's not. People in their community, and what they reflect so well is this kind of a celebration of being on the earth, as well as this kind of fear and kind of dire picture of the potential loss of everything.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the, to kind of bring it up into the happier mode from the potential loss of everything, I think that they also kind of convert that negative aspect of the world towards the belief that things will evolve into a positive future. But doing it through the absurd also means there's a relation to our own existence as well. So we feel the absurdity of who we are and where we are, and especially being in our homes at this moment. But I think that the most impact that it causes is not necessarily the absurdity of someone else, but rather the absurdity of ourselves. And when you walk through an exhibit of their work, you aren't looking at the work as a third party, as another troupe. You actually feel like you're part of it. And I think that building of a community structure, of that engagement with each other, you and the as the audience, as well as the participant, is where we find the collectivity in that absurdity. Right? There's the nihilistic perspective of we're all coming down, but at the same time, there's the perspective of how can we all come together to produce a better future.
For sure. Can I say one more thing about absurdity? Is, as a scientist and having worked on teams of field scientists, you find yourself doing absurd things all the time. And I find that reflected in their work so much. The idea of trying to, collect a salamander egg from a bog, in the middle of a driving, dusky nor'easter, is so much the experience that they kind of celebrate, in a more elaborate, embellished way.
Yeah, we all want to be part of it, right? We all want to be part of that troupe. And every little piece of dirt or clipping or beautiful view that we have or trail that we walk down or bog that we cross is all a part of the that theater of the absurd, as Maura references, right? It's all of our theater. The world is our theater. And if we don't have fun with it, then what's the point, right? We have to be part of that theater. We have to be part of and taking on the role, right? There's also a responsibility as humans to make the steps and make the effort towards making our home on Earth a better place to live and a better place to engage with.
Mm-hmm.
Guusje, I think you're on mute there for a second.
Yes, I was. Thank you. So I think that leads really nicely into my next question. All of you have touched upon kind of the relevance to our, daily lives, our situations that we find ourselves in, and kind of finding a balance or a way to cope with some of these things. And I think, Troep Vleermuis is all about kind of grappling with these issues. Like, they're traversing these landscapes that are sometimes hard to traverse. So I'm curious, what do you think that Troep Vleermuis provides for tools for us in our daily lives in order to deal with some of the issues that we face?
Well, for one thing, there's this kind of like, they become characters in their own work. It's clear right away. And there's this kind of, I think of Alexander von Humboldt, who the explorer scientist from the early 1800s, and how he collected every instrument that he could buy in Europe to go around the world and measure things. And he had no idea what he was measuring for. He just knew that, and he published this Cosmos, this life's work that was about unifying everything. And there's this impetuousness in the characters that they portray, and there's kind of it's like on a dare, they're like leaping, and they're riding the one wheeler, and it really is a positive portrayal of sort of courage in the face of the elements. But the idea that we need to bring everything, we need to pack that suitcase full and get out into nature and not be afraid to be inundated by it.
Sort of reminds me of that movie The Day After, where all the bombs have destroyed the world and the people slowly rise out of their bunkers and they're just like, what is the world now? Right? And you just kind of are exploring what is happening now and how can we renew it? How can we give it back? It also makes me think, as you were talking about Humboldt, recently I heard that every single day they discover about 5,000 new plants in the Amazon, and plants that have never been examined or discovered or named or anything. And so it's amazing the amount of biodiversity that is out there in the world and how much we can explore and continue to explore. It's almost as if this bat troop is flying, not literally, but flying across the world, kind of discovering and replanting, rewilding as they call it, this new world. We as humans are in a constant state of discovery. And if we think about time, which is very important for their work, if we think about it over millennia, if we think about it over an epoch of time, then we think about the transition and the extinction and evolution of plants and animals throughout that period. And I think it's really interesting how they adopt to that perception of the evolution of time as it relates to the rewilding and the renewal of Earth.
I've been thinking a lot about carnival, the carnival at the end of the world, the way that carnival is a kind of ritual. And the function of ritual is to take you from one state to another. Arnold van Gennep, the early anthropologist, talked about how most rituals have these phases that you go through that take you from one phase of life to another, like a marriage is something that takes you from being a single person to being part of a couple. And, you know, it has these different steps that remove you from everyday life and you come out on the other end a different person. And Carnival is like that too. You know, Carnival it happened in the winter. It was, you know, Mardi Gras is the Shrovetide holiday traditionally, where it coincides with the time that people slaughtered pigs, but also it's the period right before the fasting in Lent. And it was a way that a lot of social pressure was blown off because you had all these inversions of turning the world upside down. So, you know, men dressed as women, children dressed as old people, poor people dressed as rich people. And, you know, the king of the carnival was a poor man who was burned in effigy at the end. And it was this, you know, really big valve for letting off steam. And sometimes it went overboard and became really subversive and then got shut down. But, you know, so maybe they're providing us with their absurd rituals, their carnival, some kind of modeling for getting through, for surviving these times and I think their work it's mournful, but it's also really optimistic. And I was pulling out my book that was right next to me on the floor. Donna Haraway, in her book, Staying with the Trouble, talks about resiliency and about how we need to make kin with people, with non-human animals, to weather what's happening in the climate crisis. And I think in this crisis of the coronavirus too, you know, we have to have solidarity to find ways of being resilient. And I think their work really offers strategies for that.
I love that carnival metaphor for transformation, and also the idea of marking time. You know, as you said, the things exist in such different timescales that we might not even see them happen without these rituals to mark time. And, you know, when do we stop and count all the animals or all the plants and see what's really here? We do that, you know, after some big event, you know, after the forest fire, after the hurricane. And it's same goes for psychologically, you know, when are we transformed? And we're being transformed right now by this kind of global sort of this moment where we all are forced. I mean, it's inconceivable that we're suddenly all forced to hunker down and think. And it's only really going to be weeks and months. I say only, seems like insurmountable, but this is, in a way, then there's going to be a carnival after this, in which we reinvent ourselves, and we maybe, I mean, ideally, we come through it with some new awarenesses and values. Who knows? But artists are essential now, in decorating the walls of our caves and in pointing the way once we come out. You know, I just see them with a carnival cart leading us out of our caves into this new way of looking at the world.
Yeah, it's a moments of complete collapse that we get to reinvent ourselves.
Yeah.
I think that's really interesting and leads me into my next question, which, you know, curating at the end of the world is what we called this broadcast, inspired by the carnival at the end of the world. And I think, you know, as artists and as curators, we have this responsibility to talk about these topics, right? But these are not easy topics to broach. You know, thinking about apocalypses, we have apocalypses happening every single day. Like, we have loss of systems, we have a loss of worlds for different species. So just like, we're basically thinking at the end of so many worlds every single day. What does it mean to curate at the end of the world? What are the ways of approaching that you know, hopefully stop some worlds from changing or ending?
My first intuition is actually to go backwards, much in the same way that we were just talking about how at the end of a cataclysmic event that you then look back on, see what we had and see what was left over. It's almost the same thing with curating. It's kind of like going back in history. I also have done a lot of investigation into digital curating, and I've always found it so interesting, the original or the first online curations or exhibitions that were happening. I know this is much more of a recent history, but then also looking back in time too, they tend to pull out these moments of importance in culture as a reflection of shifting times. And so if you look back on the history of curating, you're also looking at a history of recognizing those major events that caused us to get to where we are. It's almost like looking towards, looking at the past towards a better future. And I think right now we have a huge challenge as curators to look at the present as it reflects on the future rather than as the past. It's almost like the past is every single day. Things are changing constantly as where we are right now. But when we look at what curating will be like in a year, I think that we might start to think alternatively about the whole concept of what it means to engage with a physical space. And I talk about that mainly because we're all doing this on Zoom right now. We're all doing this online. And so it's interesting that the conversion of Lux's space, and the same with museums and other institutions that are presenting work, is that how can we convert this to a way that provides accessibility for all? And so I think that when we start talking about curation in its evolution, we might also see the relationship of Kahn and Selesnick's work, how they look towards that future and that positive evolution. Perhaps now we can start to think of exhibitions as ways to engage with thought through these conversations and not necessarily just looking at an object, have the objects behind me, but we have the people in front of us and the conversations in front of us. And I think that's a really interesting perspective on how the evolution of curation will take place.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by, the challenge of curating work like this is that many of their works already are like jewel boxes. They're already like environments that are created. They're spacious, and they contain a large sense of space and time that you're peering into, and in a sense, they've made all of these spaces in their work, and then to put them chronologically or taxonomically in a gallery is it's a challenge to experience something that has such proportions in a gallery space. I mean, I really think that more and more the future of curation is to break down the walls and to experience the work in the environment somehow. But what they've done, and really provocatively, is to bring the environment into their work and then into the gallery. What do you think, Maura?
Well, I think the playfulness of their work really invites you to imaginatively inhabit those spaces.
Yeah.
And it's always very clear that people are wearing costumes, and that there's a kind of provisional quality to it, that kind of do-it-yourselfiness, where you can, they don't try to make this a seamless CGI kind of experience that you believe they've recreated something. Instead, there's always a sense that you're taking part in putting on a costume and doing this ritual. So I think, as Mark said, there's a very powerful invitation to the viewer to enter their works imaginatively, and thinking of ways to further engage is really interesting. They gave a talk last summer at 20 Summers in Provincetown at the old Hawthorne barn. And it's this wonderful, huge barn space. It's got a long history of famous artists teaching there, and it's now a residency. And what was great was that they had a lot of their objects there, like their figure covered with the revolutionary cockades was right in the center of things, and their prints were all on the floor, and they were walking barefoot around them while talking about their work. And I think it was just so it was so much a kind of like ritual and party and involvement with the audience that it's pretty powerful.
That participatory nature in their work is really potent as well. You know, I think it was both of them who mentioned that every time they have a residency or anytime they go somewhere, they sort of cull all the different families and their children and everyone around them. And so everyone becomes part of the production, everyone becomes part of the carnival. And I love how that can continue to evolve as well when we think about not necessarily people in that local space, but how can we create participatory environments, building community beyond that? How does the world itself become part of that participation and building community? And so if we think about, and Nicholas and I had this conversation, I think right before the residency began at Lux, and right after all of the COVID information was coming out, it was just kind of all at the same time. And we had this great conversation to say, okay, how can we get people at their homes to go out into the environment, build their own costumes, put on their own personalities and become part of that carnival and take photos out in the wilderness all alone, and then share those photos with us, and we'll build this larger image. And it was, I think, a little bit idealistic, and I kind of want it to happen as well. But it also makes you think, how is it that everyone can get involved with the work rather than it simply being something you have to experience only when you see it or only when you're connected to them? I think that we're all part of that carnival, right? We're all celebrating the end and the replenishment of the world. And so that's how I almost see their work evolving. Maybe that's different from the way that they see it, but I think that it would be very appropriate for all of us to participate and take a little piece of imagery. And it's almost like a challenge for all of us too.
It is.
I kind of want to see all of us go home or maybe go out into the wilderness and put on a costume. It's super easy to put on a cape or a wig or whatever. You can even make your own wig out of fabric, and you become someone else. And I think at that moment of transformation too is also the moment where you recognize the Earth's transformation and you become connected to it. You become part of it. So there's my challenge to everyone listening.
Yeah,
I would go for it, Mark, please.
Just I'll be quick, but all this work is like one big permission slip to go and do likewise. And it reminds me of whenever I do citizen science work and bring people out and put the frog in their hand, or we had preschoolers that came to our science lab, our chemistry lab, and I thought, they're never going to get this, but we had test tubes and things bubbling, and the next day the mother called me up and said, I can't get my daughter to get ready for school because she's playing scientist. And the 3-year-old had
awesome.
through mimic had kind of absorbed and digested this role that she wanted to play. We learn the roles before we even learn what it is that it means. So I think that's wonderful that their imagination kind of creates these roles that we can play.
Yeah, and also they're forcing, the curator to kind of think beyond too, right? The role of curator is relatively a very new concept, maybe like 100 years old or something around there. It's not been around very long. And how quickly that role has been innovating itself over and over again, because artists are requiring something new from their curators, like the artist as curator, the curator as collaborator, social practice, participatory practices. All of these things are forcing curators to think in new ways. And it's really exciting to hear how you feel like Kahn Selesnick's work is pushing, you know, our field forward too by asking certain things. And I loved what you said, Mark, about these jewelry, you called them jewelry boxes. Like each one, their installation is almost a cabinet of curiosity, right? Each object has this really beautiful, elaborate story behind it that we're maybe wondering, wait, what does this story actually mean? We only get a small glimpse of it, but it's really exciting to get to experience a universe of like curiosities, and yeah, it's cool. I also want to open it up to questions from the audience as well. So make sure to throw your questions in the Q&A section. Let's see.
Guusje, as questions are coming in, I also want to add another point too, that while you were speaking, it made me think a little bit about the expectation more so than the role of a curator. And oftentimes as the three of us, or the four of us, all of us have been involved with studying the history of art, we become authorities in some ways of that information, and we tell it like as if we know, we have been there and we have studied it, we've spent so much time in that area. I think part of the evolution of curation is that curating is no longer defined by one person who has an encyclopedic knowledge of a subject, but rather, and not to say that this is a good thing or a bad thing, but simply that it has evolved into how anyone can curate almost anything. And then we start to think about the role of everyone in terms of how they're looking and how they're viewing things. I find the most interesting aspect to that is it's a very strange reference, but it's Netflix. And I remember at the very beginning of Netflix, they put out a call to engineers, to data modeling engineers, to find out how to discover movies that people wanted to see. And so if you looked at a movie, you knew that this person would like another movie based on that information. And then as you watched more movies, you would get better at defining what people liked. And I wonder if curation also can act in a similar way, in the sense that as people look and appreciate things, they start to see more of what they like and what they want to see, while at the same time adding more that kind of makes their ears and their eyes turn. And I think that, bringing it back to Kahn Selesnick's work, they have that ability to drag you into something that you like, while also feeding you other things, right? Not everyone is impressed or excited or moved by a hanging bat with fur all over them, with old fur coats, but right next to it is a feathered mannequin sculpture, and right next to that is a landscape where you feel like you can dive into and you can be part of it. So I think that there's this nature of their work that also speaks towards a sense of individuality within the viewer, and offers that individuality, and in some ways deauthorizes the curator and puts it more in the hands of the viewer.
I was thinking about something quite similar, because when I was looking first at their images of the floating world, which is all the people floating with flowers around them, I kept thinking, oh, these are too pretty. I don't know, just too pretty. And then I thought, what is this? Why am I getting so upset about beauty? And I pulled out a couple books I hadn't looked at in a long time. And one is Elaine Scarry's little book called On Beauty and Being Just, where she talks about the way that beauty has been has been treated as something that's less important in modern times, that that beauty seems to be apolitical or less critical. And she argues instead that the contemplation of beauty can inspire wonder, and that wonder can encourage us to want to preserve the beautiful thing or the beautiful person. So there's a kind of moral sense of justice in the contemplation of engaging with beauty. And then she quoted, I have this in my notes here, she quoted Simone Weil, who said that beauty requires us to give up our imaginary position at the center. And this radically decenters us from what we perceive as the world. This happens in our bodies, so that when we contemplate the beautiful, we are unselfed. We don't put all of our energy into protecting the interests of ourself, and instead we're freed to care about someone or something else. Like when we contemplate a beautiful bird, we're taken out of our bodies, and we're no longer thinking just about ourselves. And that maybe this sense of wonder and enchantment can encourage a kind of ethical desire to protect the non-human world. So I think that's a way in which, you know, the curator can highlight their interest in visual pleasure, and make this not simply a kind of eye candy for the viewer, but to engage them with a kind of, you know, ethical commitment.
Yeah, no Insta porn.
You know, that's what you say, Maura, is so relevant to me. You know, there was I don't know, a couple years ago, there was a new book about the evolution of beauty and how essential. So there's some theories that kind of reinterpret Darwin to show how beauty functions in survival, and that it's not just about individual survival, that there's a kind of fitness, you know, in scientific terms, that and attractiveness that is, you know, it's kind of one of the contradictions in their work, that you know, they're all dressed up for an outing. Maybe not the right outing, but they're certainly all dressed up, and you know, the costumes, and that, you know, there's a kind of, it harks back to you know, old traditions, almost neo-colonial traditions of how you go out into the world, but also, you know, echoes the way the animal world, you know, decks itself in beauty in order to go out for this pitch for survival.
Yeah, I love that. We just got a really great question, and I think inspired by what we're talking about, should we expect a new movement in art after this pandemic era?
That's big. Of course, yeah. We're on it.
It already happened, right? It's already happening. I mean, I speak with artists often, and they're all thinking about it. They're all making already as a response to it. Yeah.
And you know, there's this image that we get to see for the first time of the world emptied of us. So that's a really a leap in consciousness, to see Grand Central Station and to see Venice and these places empty of people, and that's the shift in consciousness that makes us think, what is our place? You know, it'll make us regret re-inhabiting those spaces in exactly the same way.
The weirdest part to me, or the most surreal part to me, is that we've seen these places without humans before, right? In post-apocalyptic narratives, we've had the opportunity to see what Los Angeles will be like when humans are not there, or New York when humans are not there, and it's this really surreal moment where we are living these apocalypses right now.
And then what will survive? You know, there's J.B. Jackson was a landscape writer, critical landscape, and he wrote a book called The Necessity of Ruins, and how ruins give us a template for our own future existence. And if we look around and see what's disposable and what remnants might survive, it kind of gives you a different perspective on what you're buying and using and throwing away.
Does anybody have any final thoughts they would like to share?
I just hope that I get to go on more expeditions with these guys. Even if I'm lying in a cold stream covered with flowers and fish and apples for hours at a time.
Yeah, when they were doing the residency in Provincetown last spring, I think I was in the middle of grading exams, and I get a text from Nick going, "Hey, want to come down to Provincetown this morning? We're going to put a big wig on you and take you out in the marsh so you could be Medusa." I'm like, yes.
That's awesome.
And then we were done shooting. I had this big, well, actually it was mostly my own hair with cotton wool underneath it, piled up really high, and I had flour on my face and this crazy shimmery costume with a big skirt sticking out to the side. I had some kind of stick, and I'm standing by the side of the road waiting for them to come and pick me up, and there are all these cars going by, and I was just waving.
I love that.
It was great.
Was it at least during February and people just assumed you were celebrating Carnival?
No, it was, I think it was April or May.
Oh, okay.
But it was Provincetown, so, you know,
Okay.
who knows what it was about. Yeah.
Springtime, it's okay.
It is.
Well, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, all three of you, for joining today's discussion. I always love hearing other curators' perspectives and approaches. And Mark, I'm looking very much forward to doing our conversation as well about
Yeah, me too.
territories. It's going to be really wonderful. And tomorrow we have our final studio visit with Kahn Selesnick. So tune in tomorrow at 2 p.m. Pacific Standard Time to get to ask your questions to Kahn Selesnick, to get an update on their residency project. And that will be all for On Air this week. And then next week we'll be back with a lot of other programming, which I can tell you a little bit more about. Let me grab that real quick. We have a regional artist tour collection tour with Michelle Montjoy, our regional artist that we have in our Brandon's Gallery. She'll be showing us the artists that she's collected over the years, tell them stories about them, how she got the pieces. And then next week, Friday, we have Kahn Selesnick's studio series, their big artist talk, where they'll be telling us much more than what we've had the opportunity to hear so far on air, all different stories, and how the process works, how they started, their history, their influences, and their bodies of work. And then next week, Saturday, we have their final reading from their book, 100 Views of the Drowning World. Join in for that as well. That was it. Thank you all so much. Oh, one more shout out to Robichaud Gallery. They could not join us today as planned, but we will be showing their video in May, early May, the video from their exhibition in Denver, Kahn Selesnick's exhibition. And I'm really excited to be sharing that with you guys. It's a really wonderful video, and I look forward to that as well and seeing you all soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.